everybody that comes to Japan has this Japanese dream, but oftentimes their ideals can bump up against the reality. As typical of the Japanese countryside, land can be stuck in kind of a bureaucratic limbo. It's ripe for some kind of sustainable agricultural project, but there'd be people coming to see these foreigners with these gaijin volunteers and farming in a way that looks weird. They can get a bit defensive.
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we welcome Byron. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
You're the founder of Kasamatsu Farms, a permaculture regenerative agriculture farm at the border of Kanagawa and Yamanashi, where you moved to, I think, more than 10 years ago.
That's right.
To establish yourself and renovate an old farm and kind of develop your own system. And we're going to talk about permaculture. We're going to talk about what's it like moving to the countryside,
right.
And the challenges that come with it. But you came to Japan 20 years ago, I think.
That's right.
What brought you here in the first place?
So originally, I am from just outside of New York City, in New Jersey. And, my parents both immigrated to the United States from Europe, from Germany and from Hungary. And, I didn't have any exposure to Asia or Japan growing up. It wasn't until later in middle school, I had a friend who was Japanese who was going to the same school as me in the US. And, at the time, I had friends from many different countries in this kind of diverse area. So I never really thought about Japan or where he was from, but we reconnected through the internet and Facebook in university, and he suggested I come and visit him in Japan. And that was kind of the first thing that brought me here. I came, I spent a month in Japan just traveling around. He was a college student at the time at Keio in Tokyo, and he played in a punk band on the weekends, and it was just a very eye-opening experience for me, and very different from the environment and the culture that I had been exposed to growing up. And that in itself was kind of exciting. I found myself in a place after high school where, some people, they're like, oh, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a lawyer, or I want to become a veterinarian. They had like a very clear path set in front of them. And I think, many people are not really at that point, at that stage in their life where they know exactly what their passion is or what they're interested in. For me, it was kind of Japan that sparked that interest. But interestingly, if my friend was Korean or Chinese, I could have just as easily wound up in a different part of Asia. It was more kind of just the culture that was so drastically different from Western and European culture. That's kind of what attracted me to here in the first place.
So you came here for a month, traveled around with a friend and explored the country, and oh, this is pretty cool. And then you go back to New York.
And I was like, I want to start learning Japanese. I want to come to Japan. And I went to university in New York, and I didn't have, an incredible Japanese language program in the school. So I was very, very self-motivated. I had taken classes at like the Japan Society in downtown Manhattan, and I was really, I'd come home from my regular classes and just start studying kanji and just furiously like memorizing Japanese characters. And I was really motivated, and it's interesting because I had studied German, I had studied French, and I did horrible studying French in high school because I just wasn't personally motivated to study the language at the time. But Japanese, I really was self-motivated, and my linguistic ability just improved dramatically in a short period of time. And then I came back to Japan my third year of university as an exchange student at Waseda University for 1 year. And I mean, you've been to a university in Japan.
Yeah, same one.
Right? So you have somewhat of a contextual experience yourself. It was very different from my experience in the US and university, but what I really benefited from most was like living with a Japanese roommate, taking part in the Japanese like social scene. Those kind of like social activities gave me kind of insight into Japanese culture at a much deeper level than just taking a class in a
Are there
university.
any specific aspects back then that you remember that made you feel like, oh, this is really cool, I want more of this, and that were specifically different from your experience back in the States?
Well, I mean, take like the izakaya and drinking culture in college in Japan. Like it's very different from what you might experience in the West.
Frat parties in the US.
Well, I mean, maybe, yeah. Well, not in New York so much, but yeah. Yeah, it seemed very different and unique. And if you're going to work in like a corporate environment in Japan, there's lots of like soft communication skills that you kind of gain in that university setting that then kind of play out in corporate Japan.
The famous
Communication,
communication.
yeah, exactly.
So you learned that in university, and that was kind of like interesting for you to see how different it is. And after university, you graduate. Did you go back?
I went
to
back
the
to the
States?
States. I graduated university, and then I came right back to Japan again on the JET program, not as an English teacher, but as a CIR. It's called the Coordinator for International Relations.
It's interesting because yesterday we recorded another podcast episode with Nick, which will be released shortly before our conversation. And it's the first time I heard about this. I thought JET was just for English teachers, but it's not.
Yeah, so if you have a certain level of Japanese proficiency, then they can place you in like a local prefectural office or a town hall or work for the Board of Education as a CIR.
Where did you get placed?
And so I was in Kyushu, in Miyazaki Prefecture, in a small town up in the mountains. And arguably looking back on it, this was kind of like the pinnacle of my, experience in Japan.
So early on?
So early on, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's all been downhill from them, but it was kind of like maximum autonomy with minimum responsibility and disposable income and free time. I'm single. I don't have like a family that I have to worry about. And so, I had the opportunity to travel within Japan, travel outside of Japan, and the work hours were very forgiving. I had a lot of free time on my hands. But I was impatient, coming from New York. I want to kind of move on to the next thing. I felt somewhat isolated in the Japanese countryside, and I was just biding my time until I would make like a career move to Tokyo. And so after my 1-year contract expired on the JET program, I decided not to recontract, and I wanted to make the transition to Tokyo. And I had this kind of image in my head of, from seeing Japanese pop culture or manga or, what do you call it? Like sitcoms, Japanese sitcoms. At the time when I was in the US, I was grabbing onto every little thing that I could get about Japan to understand the culture, right? So, I watched some manga and dramas and everything. But then by the time I got here, I was all right, now I'm here. I'm not really interested in like manga and dramas anymore. It was just whatever I could do to understand Japan. And so I had this kind of akogare in Japanese, like
admiration.
Admiration for the salaryman Tokyo career lifestyle.
That's an interesting kind of thing to admire, right? I would say that for many people, this is a thing. No, I don't want to be like that.
Yeah, but at that point in my life, and especially after this experience in the countryside, I felt like I'm not doing my career a favor by just staying in the countryside longer. Little did I know I'd wind up back in the Japanese countryside. But
first, you end up getting this stint in corporate Japan.
Right.
You find this familiar, fast-paced environment that you have from New York, maybe back in Tokyo. What did you end up doing in Tokyo?
Right. So I got a job with a company called Persona that is in the human resources business. And at the time, this was like 2008, just before the global financial crisis. And their main business was temping. And they were putting a lot of effort into trying to help Japanese companies that were internationalizing to hire bilingual non-Japanese staff, encouraging their client companies to hire staff, particularly people like myself who had studied abroad in Japan or who had come to Japan on the JET program. So I was kind of given the project of creating a human resources development program to help people who were coming to Japan as study abroad students or through the JET program to then get placed in Japanese companies. And, it was a very interesting experience working in Marunouchi in central Tokyo and, wearing the suit, doing the whole Japanese shushoku katsudo experience. And I lived in a Japanese dormitory
Oh,
for the
wow.
first year and a half that I was working with this company.
How was that like?
That was interesting. I mean, I looking back on it, it was a good experience. It's nice to have the company sponsor housing, but at the same time, your housing then is linked to your employment with this company, so they kind of got you.
It feels like you're basically 24/7 at work.
Right. So I remember taking the train, the commute to the office, and I mean, it was a unique environment because at the time there were really not a lot of Westerners working for this company either, and so I was one of the few non-Japanese, non-Asian Westerners working there, and given a little bit of a kind of special treatment in some ways. Like I took the train to work the first week or two that I was working for the company, and it was a pretty typical commute for Tokyo, 1 hour from the dorm through Ikebukuro and then on the Marunouchi-sen, the Chikatetsu, the subway. But I was just completely exhausted by the time I got there, because it's everything that you imagine, people fighting for space on the subway and the guys with the white gloves pushing people into the train cars. And I was like, I showed up and I told my coworkers, I don't know if I can handle this. And they're like, it's okay, you'll get used to it. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to get used to this. So that was kind of when I first started having doubts about my decision to kind of pursue this salaryman lifestyle.
Admiration for the salaryman lifestyle is slowly starting to fade a little bit, and the kind of darker side of it.
Yeah, and then the whole, the communication culture as well. That's all great when you're like a college student or when you're single and in your 20s, but by the time you're a little bit older, you don't want to be spending time drinking with people that you don't really have much in common with, and just for the sake of your job. So I think that whole culture has gotten a lot of criticism, even among younger generations of Japanese nowadays.
It's changing a little bit.
Yeah.
But the big event for you was then the 2011 earthquake.
Well, yes, it was. Before that, though, the financial crisis happened. And after 2009, 2008, and the project that I was working on got cut because it really affected the temping industry as a whole. And so Persona's like, okay, this was never going to be our core moneymaker for our business. The gaijin are nice to have, but it's not like they got to focus on shoring up their core business. And so I found myself without a contract that was renewed, basically homeless because I had been living in a dorm at the time. And I realized to what extent I was dependent upon my employer if I worked this way. And so that, because of my background now that I had, had some experience in human resources and recruitment, I was really giving a lot of thought to the work culture in Japan and the traditional employment system in Japan, where you're working with one company your whole life, and how that was kind of being chipped away at, especially after the financial crisis. And so I started, getting approached by other companies and people that I knew in this time where I was looking for new opportunities, and they're like, hey, do you want to potentially work with our company? We're looking for somebody bilingual. And I'm like, maybe, or maybe I can help find somebody that will. And so I kind of tacked from working for a company doing this human resources development to building my own recruitment business as a freelancer, and then as eventually as a small business owner in Japan doing recruitment. But yes, the financial crisis first kind of showed the cracks of this kind of dependency of this consumer lifestyle in the city, but it was really the earthquake that kind of shocked me out of my sense of complacency in the city and changed my direction, kind of where I was heading in Japan.
What was the big change? Why did you suddenly then decide to kind of leave that behind and move back to the countryside?
So, working in any service industry job, there's not a clear connection between the work you do and the value that you're actually creating, because you're not actually creating a physical product. There's many advantages to that, right? Consulting in general is a very lucrative industry. But as far as personally feeling like the work you do is creating value for somebody other than just moving people or moving numbers from one place to another, I just felt like I didn't feel that connection. And then it was a kind of feeling of being disconnected, in a lot of ways from what I need for my life. For example, like the food or energy that I consume in the city. People are just not aware of where their food comes from or where the energy that they're consuming comes from. And there's just not a very direct feedback loop between, most people's consumption and the actual environmental costs or costs in general. And so the earthquake happened, and I saw food on the shelves in Tokyo disappear. I saw the transportation system grind to a halt. People who lived in fancy apartments, swaying back and forth in the earthquake. And then the Fukushima disaster afterwards really brought the idea of like energy self-sufficiency and food self-sufficiency kind of, interest in these areas really peaked in Japan, even among Japanese people. So it became a very trendy topic, even in media in Japan, in this post-Fukushima disaster period.
Was it then a moment that you just decided, okay, I'm leaving this, I'm moving, or was it then a process where you're like, okay, my objective is for the next year I want to move out of the city and kind of find a place on the land?
I was kind of questioning my trajectory at the time. Like, do I pursue a master's degree and really do like an MBA and potentially like leave Japan to pursue business somewhere else, but I think it was two things. It was the allure of the Japanese countryside. Even though I had lived in the Japanese countryside, when I was still living in Tokyo, I had the opportunity to travel, 1 hour, 2 hours out of the city on the weekends. And then I made relationships with people in this town, and I was able to rent like this house in the country for, I think it was about, $100 a month. And it was just this, not like an Akiya Kominka type house, more just somebody's vacation home. But the deal was I only have to pay $100 a month, and I can do whatever I want to the house. And so it kind of became this experimentation place where I could just go on the weekends, leave my city life, and start experimenting, doing small things like growing my own food or DIYing my house that I was renting at the time. And I got a lot of joy out of that, of just doing something physical with my hands, seeing if I plant this seed, I can actually grow something, and that can become the food that I ate. And it was very motivating in a different way from life in the city. And I felt a lot of a sense of independence, and that seemed very attractive, because in the city you're very dependent upon either a job for a salary or the infrastructure or the systems that provide for your life.
The services need to work, otherwise you don't have anything.
There's nothing, right? And so that, and my interest in the more traditional side of Japan, the traditional Japanese culture, Japanese architecture, the countryside of Japan. I started kind of that was the stuff that kind of attracted me to Japan in the first place. It wasn't the drinking parties in Tokyo and the crowded subway system, and I felt like I was missing that living in the city. And so going out to the country, having this place to just experience and experiment and do things. And then, that coincided with, in the aftermath of the earthquake, I was getting interested in sustainability and interested in permaculture, which I had heard somewhat about. Permaculture is essentially a design system for sustainable human habitation. And it's not necessarily growing food or having a garden, but growing food and having a garden is perhaps part of permaculture design as a whole. It's like a design system where you just organize elements and figure out how you can set up a system, create a holistic design where the different parts are working together, and you can minimize input into the system. And the idea is, it's very much focused on perennial systems and circular systems where you take waste products and connect them so you have it become a resource, and working within the community to do that.
So you have all these ideas that kind of start merging together. Okay, countryside, sustainability, permaculture. You get to experiment a little bit with that place you're renting, but eventually you are going for Kasamatsu Farms.
Well, yes, yeah.
How do you find that place and how did that get started?
So that's kind of a long tangent, but I had taken a permaculture course in Japan at the Permaculture Center of Japan, which is in this town, Fujino, which is on the corner of Yamanashi and Kanagawa Prefecture, which is where I live now. And Fujino is a very interesting and progressive community. What makes it really unique is that over half of the population is people who've moved to the area.
Okay.
And its proximity to Tokyo, it's only an hour outside of Tokyo, but it's like a world away from Tokyo in terms of the regional culture and the environment in general. It's very rural. And somewhat isolated up in the mountains. So over the years, since even World War II, there's been a history of artists and alternatively minded people moving out of Tokyo and moving to the Fujino community. And that's kind of built over the decades. And then the government kind of got on board and was really keen to kind of promote Fujino as a cultural and artistic community. So they built a bit of a reputation with that kind of alternative, sustainable lifestyle. And then the earthquake saw a huge interest in people moving to Fujino, because this was still, when telework or working remotely hadn't really become commonplace, especially in Japan. So people could actually live in Fujino and commute every day into a day job in central Tokyo. And for that reason, you had all these creative people and working white collar professionals that were moving to this area and really kind of interested in balancing their careers with Tokyo while at the same time pursuing some kind of sustainable or alternative lifestyle. And so I had taken a permaculture course in Fujino. And at the time, I never thought that I would move to Fujino. But it kind of got me thinking about what I could do if I could get access to land and, building some semblance of resiliency for, myself and my family with all the shocks and unknown of, these kind of disasters.
What does this permaculture course from this Center of Permaculture of Japan entail? What do you really learn there, and what?
So in Japan, they split it up into a design course and a practical course. And I had taken the design course, and it's basically about holistic permaculture design. They talk about it from many angles, from the architecture to the gardening and the companion planting, and solutions for natural pests, keeping pests away from produce. And then there's a community and environmental aspect to permaculture as well, because pursuits of sustainability in general, it's not it could be an individual endeavor, but it's very, very difficult to pursue being completely off-grid or sustainable without the help of other people around you as part of a community. And so it was that community aspect that really intrigued me about Fujino. And at the time I was kind of, all right, I'm not really feeling getting an MBA and going into some corporate climbing the ladder, pursuit. I was interested in sustainability, but I didn't have an academic background in sustainability. So I decided to take a master's course at the United Nations University in Tokyo. And my fieldwork and my research was about the transition town movement, which is a movement that had started in the UK in 2008, 2009. And it was about community-based grassroots attempts to build a more resilient local community using the local resources. So kind of taking permaculture, aspects of permaculture design and overlapping that onto an existing community and saying, okay, in this community, what are the resources and what are our goals and objectives? What are we trying to accomplish 20, 30 years from now? What do we want our community to look like in terms of building a more resilient community to the shocks of peak oil and climate change and kind of economic shock that's associated with that? So I was intrigued with the transition town movement, and Fujino was the first and most developed transition town in Japan at the time. And so I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. I want to conduct field work. And I did a social research, basically, about how the transition town movement was established? Why did it come to Fujino? And why was it so successful, arguably, in the Fujino area compared to other areas? And so that brought me to Fujino, kind of coming and meeting the people who are involved in the Transition Town movement. And that community aspect is really kind of what attracted me to the area. And so
in the end, the decision to leave Tokyo, the decision to move to Fujino, and the decision to kind of build Kasamatsu Farms was not a spur of the moment decision. It's something that kind of really gradually happened from the first cracks of the crowded trains into additional studies, into back and forth to this community.
Yeah.
But eventually you were saying that you started thinking, what could I do if I have some land? So how did you find that piece of land that you now kind of are developing?
So my partner and I, my wife, who's Japanese, but she went to international school, so she's like a native English speaker as well. She wasn't native to this area, Fujino, but we decided to make a go at leaving Tokyo and moving up to this area after I had conducted this social research. And I spent a lot of time initially thinking about like the ideal place, the ideal situation. I make this joke that, if you're a Westerner and you've been living in Japan for more than 10 years, you get this itch where you just want to renovate an old Japanese house and move to the countryside. And
many people's dreams.
Exactly, yeah. That's a dream that's shared by many people. And it was my dream as well at the time. And so I was really interested in trying to find the ideal spot, some little valley up in the mountains with an old Japanese house that I could renovate. And I came upon this village very close to the house that I was renting up in the mountains. And this area, it's called the Tibet of Kanagawa because it's just a very mountainous area. You've got like the clouds and the mist on a rainy day. And, typical of the Japanese countryside in general, there's just so many natural resources that nowadays are not really able to be managed anymore the way they were by generations in the past. And so that agricultural infrastructure, that natural infrastructure and resources, it's just, from a permaculture standpoint, it just seems like, wow, there's so much here. And this village that I found had kind of a tragic past. The village at one point was a village of 9 houses up in the mountains. And about 15, 20 years ago, before I had moved to the area, there was a fire that had burned down 5 of the 9 houses in this village. And nobody was injured, but it was pretty devastating for them culturally. And everybody decided to just collect insurance money and move out to a more convenient location. And so there were still 3 houses in the area that were lived in by old timers that had been there for generations in the past, but the vast majority of the people had moved out. And so a lot of the land, a lot of the agricultural land was not being managed anymore. And it just seemed like, wow, this little pocket is, it's ripe for some kind of local revitalization project, some kind of sustainable agricultural project. And my dream was to tie that in with agritourism, farm to table, all these different concepts that I was very attracted to because of my interests and experience.
So you get a place there, you settle in this new community.
And that wasn't an easy process, getting a place there. As typical of the Japanese countryside, a lot of times properties and land can be stuck in kind of a bureaucratic limbo in terms of like inheritance, in terms of like the actual legality of who owns the property. Agricultural land is protected in Japan. And oftentimes, if you don't have an agricultural license, you're not able to purchase or rent agricultural land. And I was learning all these kind of complications and things, trial by fire, just through the experience. And but from an outside perspective, it just seemed like, wow, this is a walk. This is it. This is like a walk in the park. There's all this land, and I'm coming with all this positivity and positive intentions to learn from the local people and work with the local people to try to revitalize this place. And so it took me a year. I had met the old man who still lived in the village, and he was a bit of an alcoholic and really into pachinko, and he had a lot of vices, but he also had a heart of gold. He kind of fit that trope of the old grumpy guy, but who actually is pretty helpful. And he was very open, and he said, oh, if you and your wife, you're interested in moving here and living in this area, I'd be happy to sell you the land, but it's not in my name. It's in the name of my dead father who died. And this guy was like 80 at the time. So it was in the name of his father who had died like 30 years ago.
And they didn't transfer
he had
it.
8 brothers and sisters, and everybody was like infighting, and like real estate agents wouldn't touch this place because it would just be a huge waste of time. One person doesn't give the hanko, the stamp, and then they've wasted all their time. So I consulted with local real estate agents, and they were like, well, if you really want it, you got to just figure out how to make it happen. And so I was fortunate to meet like a local guy who was kind of a mover and shaker in the community, and he had been very influential in bringing outsiders to Fujino over the years. He worked for the local government at one point, and now he was just doing it as a kind of local service, trying to help interesting people get set up in this area. And so he pointed me in the right direction, but it took a year of negotiating, and I had to drive like 70, 80-year-old people to the town hall and buy them an inkan because they didn't even own an inkan, and get them to register the stamp and then sort out the paperwork. And
so you must have really wanted that space.
I did, and I called it the stamp rally because it was like I was going around collecting stamps from everyone, and I managed to make it happen. But there had been people who had tried and failed to buy the same property over the years, and it was only through my persistence that I was really able to kind of bring the pieces together, purchase the land for building our house, and I wanted to get set up in this valley, and I also wanted to renovate an akiya, a kominka. That was always in the back of my mind. But finding that ideal spot, where you could renovate a kominka that has the kind of resources that were in this place, sometimes you have to be pragmatic, right? Like as I said, that area is a very popular area. So even when old houses come onto the market, they tend to go through just like word of mouth and whom right? So it's a challenge to find that ideal place. And I came across another akiya that was kind of in many ways what I was looking for. It was an old 150-year-old Japanese farmhouse that had been lived in until relatively recently, but the current state of it didn't do justice to what I saw the potential to be of the place.
So you had this idea, this vision for the farm. You finally have a farm. You complete your stamp rally.
Got the land for building the house. Don't have the farm yet.
But you described permaculture as kind of being a system that is regenerative, that is circular.
Yeah.
Now that you have this land, where do you even start? What do you do first? How did you approach building Kasamatsu Farms?
I told myself when we first moved out there, because I was coming from this kind of white collar background, that I never want to commercially farm. I never want to be a farmer. I don't want to grow vegetables and sell them and attempt to support myself that way, because it's a tough game in Japan. Produce is very fresh and local. Japanese consumers don't have much of an interest in organic the way that it's popular in the West. And the prices are cheap. The prices of produce are relatively cheap compared to organic produce in the US. So as a farmer, it's not exactly a lucrative venture. But as far as a lifestyle goes, as far as trying to develop a semblance of self-sufficiency or feel value or gratification through the work that you do, farming and gardening and incorporating that into a larger permaculture design for your lifestyle is a really attractive thing. And so it was more of a pursuit of a lifestyle than it was ever, we want to build a farm or we want to operate, farming or sell produce to anybody. That kind of happened over the years organically.
So you basically just decide to move there, have a quieter life, renovate that akiya, and little by little started implementing some farming, and then you have a chickens, and then you have kind of other things that you little by little expanded.
So we bought the land for building a house. My wife was pregnant at the time, and we were having our first child. And I felt like, okay, I really want to build a place, a safe place to raise a family. And so that was kind of my motivation as a husband, as a father, to pursue this lifestyle. The same way that somebody would pursue a corporate job to build a sense of security for their family. That was kind of what the driving factor was and the motivation was. But the financials and turning that into a business to support yourselves, those were things that I had kind of like shunned away from, coming from the consumer lifestyle in Tokyo. I wanted to pursue a life of meaning and feel like the work that I was doing was mattering and creating something, and do something creative. And that's kind of what this pursuit offered. But I bit off more than I can chew. So we had finally gotten access to the land, gotten access to a bit of farmland, and then I had found this other kominka in the one that I had just mentioned, in the neighboring valley, across the border in Yamanashi. And I'm like, well, opportunities like this don't come by all the time in this area, even though it's not an ideal time because I'm trying to build a house at the same time. I'm going to go for it and try to like rent or acquire this akiya.
That's a big bite.
Right. And the plan was to renovate it and then turn that into a hotel where we can kind of combine our hospitality efforts with what we were doing with our lifestyle in terms of the farming and the sustainability and the permaculture connected to the agritourism stuff that we were doing. Now, ideally, that farmhouse would have been in this village where we were building our house up in the mountains, and everything would have been tucked neatly into one place. But, it was a 5-minute, 10-minute car ride away from, our base of operations. So it seemed like we could still kind of connect it to what we were doing. And so, with the help, at this time we were already hosting like volunteers and interns, and we had registered on Woof, which is like a website for young people who are interested in volunteering on organic farms. And so we were hosting people who are coming from abroad to be involved in kind of our organic alternative lifestyle, while at the same time doing these kind of like farmhouse, kominka, akiya renovation projects and traditional Japanese like craft projects, like the plastering and earthen walls and all these aspects of traditional Japanese craft and architecture that had really attracted me. And so it was about a year-long project. We renovated the guest house, and then we started operating the guest house. But I'm only one person. I only have 24 hours a day, and now I've got a small child, and our resources are spread thin. And so we're starting this monumental project of building our own house in this village up in the mountains. And, I looked at contemporary construction in Japan. I looked at the way that people went about building a house. And most people, they take out a housing loan, 30 years, pay it back while they're working their job. And then at the end of that, the loan's paid off, but the house is also not worth anything anymore. And, houses in Japan, modern houses, are not really built to last longer than a generation anyway, compared to what you might experience in Europe.
Yeah.
So I felt like I didn't want to go down that route. I didn't want to be tied into a corporate job and have to pay off loans for 30 years to a property that's not going to be valued, beyond, the land that it's sitting on. And so I thought I wanted to DIY it. And it was a monumental undertaking building this house with the resources that we had over the years. We had experimented a few things with this cheap house that I rented, and then renovating the guest house. But this was going to be kind of like the culmination of like all my passion and interest in the Japanese countryside and Japanese traditional architecture and craft and everything. The ultimate eco house, so to speak. And
many people dream about exactly that.
Exactly.
And now you've renovated or worked on renovations of 3 of these kind of properties.
Yeah.
What are like the main things that you weren't really aware that became very big challenges for you to solve that people should know about?
Well, so I was really, really interested in like natural building. I was interested in working with natural materials and building a house that would not be torn down in 30 years, that would have lasting value, just like these old kominkas. And so I was interested in timber frame construction. I had cut down most of the trees for my house myself in the local area. Some of the
Can
trees,
you just go and cut trees?
some of the trees were planted by the old man that had sold me the property
Mm-hmm.
when he was like 16, and now he was 80. And he said, like, you can cut down the trees that I planted on this plot of land.
Wow.
And so, I had this experience of cutting down the timber and then hand shaping the beams into that traditional kind of octagonal hand hewn shape. And I found a carpenter to work with me on this project. And it was challenging because in Japan, craftsmen have such a high level of mastery in what they do. And that's really respectable. But they also don't want to really have your involvement in what they're doing. And as somebody who was very hands-on and wanted to kind of learn the skills as I was doing it, I wanted the experience of being able to kind of actually be involved in the process of building this house with both myself and then with my family along the way. And so I talked to a bunch of craftsmen, and everybody was like, Moody, like, it's just what you want to do with the budget that you have. Nobody wanted to touch it because it was just like, they want to just come in, knock it out, and then move on to the next project. They don't want to be caught up in something that's going to drag on for years. And I was a bit optimistic, about what I could accomplish, even just in terms of the house build. And so I had designed this kind of like ultimate eco house, passive solar, natural clay walls, traditional timber frame construction, split bamboo lattice in the walls for earthen walls, and Japanese plastering and everything. All these different aspects of natural building and traditional Japanese craft that I wanted to incorporate into this. But people don't build houses like that for a reason, because it's an incredible involvement of labor. And if that labor is not coming from yourself, it's coming from paid labor. And so it's either going to be really, really expensive, or it's going to take a very long time, even with the help of volunteers and personal dedication over the years. And I met this one carpenter who, he made this comment. He said to me, I told him what I wanted to do. And this was this really interesting kind of wild guy out in Yamanashi who he would go into the mountains and chop down a tree and then like carve the tree right there and then carry the timber out with him and do traditional Japanese timber frame.
Old school.
Yeah. And I was like, this is the guy I want to get in to help, do the frame of our house. And I told him we want to build a house this big and do this. And he was like, no, I'm not going to help you. And he said this comment that I still remember, which was like, if you build in Japanese, roughly translated, it was like when you build a house, when you work with wood and build a house, you chisel the wood, but you also chisel a part of yourself. You chisel away a part of yourself. And I'm like, what is this guy talking about? I just want his help to build this dream house. I didn't really understand where he was coming from, but years down the line, I kind of have a different sense of appreciation.
You put a lot of yourself into the work.
Exactly.
To kind of,
and it was a very personal journey. So I had met this guy, but he wasn't the one. And then I met another guy who was like, it's going to take years. And this was a guy who had worked on like shrines and temples, and he had the skill of working as a traditional Japanese carpenter, a craftsman, but he was pretty much retired. And so he didn't really feel like building a house anymore, but if I wanted to do it, he was willing to kind of teach me what he knew. And so he became my mentor in this house building process, my sensei, my oyakata kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just kind of instrumental along the way and kind of encouraging me and saying, well, it's going to take time. But if you're willing to put in the time and the resources to do this, I'll help you do it. And so that kind of got us started with the project.
So it was a huge endeavor to end up
first getting the land,
having
the vision, getting the kind of academic knowledge and background, and then saying, okay, this is it. This is what I want to pursue.
How many years are we talking about?
I came to Fujino 10 years ago. My daughter's 11 now, and she was just born shortly after we moved there. So it's been about 10, 11 years that we've been working in.
And it's still not like quote unquote finished?
Well, yeah, I don't know if the house ever will be, in a sense, because it's such a personal project that it's almost like this art project that you've been working on, where you're putting yourself into it. And in some ways, the closer it gets to completion, the less I'm enjoying the process, because it was never about building the house. It was kind of about building the lifestyle and experiencing things and learning things, and the learning curve and the challenges along the way. That's kind of what I wanted out of the whole experience.
You talked about one of the big things for these projects is also like financing, and you didn't want to have a loan, and you didn't want to have a corporate job to finance this. So you went down the agro business, agricultural, agrotourism side of business, where you bring in people to the area and you show them this kind of permaculture. You have them stay at your guest house, and you can teach them.
That's right. I was already getting a bit kind of jaded with life in Japan, because I had been in Japan for 10 years already by that time. And I wanted to live vicariously through the eyes of other people who come and see what I've created, or what I've highlighted or showcased about Japanese culture, what was attractive to me at one point in Japan. Now that all became commonplace because I see it every day. So by creating the guest house and creating the farm and having inbound tourists coming and visiting, that was kind of always the motivation for me to kind of tie it into tourism.
It revived a little bit your interest into kind of showcasing everything you've now.
That was what I thought, right? But once we actually opened the guest house and started marketing ourselves through booking.com and Airbnb and taking reservations, we quickly realized that our market wasn't so much like inbound tourists, because Fujino is not a on the main track tourist area. It's not Nara, it's not Hakone, it's not
Kyoto.
Right? It's not some place that foreigners who visit Japan for the first time come and check out. It's deeper than that. And we found quickly that our main market was just Japanese people who were interested in renting a house and coming up and visiting the countryside. And they had very defined kind of ways of wanting to spend their time, barbecue in the summer and go down to the river. But it was like a little bit different, because they didn't resonate with my ideals for sustainability or the traditional side of Japanese culture. So, I had kind of started it with this intention of attracting inbound tourists to what, I saw as a really beautiful part of Japan. But we found out quickly that our core business was Japanese people who were coming up with their friends and their families and visiting and renting the eco lodge. And so there was a bit of a disconnect there. And then COVID happened. And at this point, we were already 5-6 years into operating the lodge, and we had built a bit of traction with our Japanese market. And I had still been, I had also done hospitality work in Tokyo. I had, during the Airbnb boom in downtown Edo, Tokyo, I had rented and then sublet a couple of houses. And so it was bringing in cash to fund our renovation and building our own house. But that all changed with the licensing, and we had to shut down operations in Tokyo and then just focused purely on our business in the countryside. And COVID happened, and the borders were closed. No inbound tourists were coming, and Japanese tourists weren't traveling. And what had become kind of our financial backbone of our lifestyle was now threatened. And we found that we had built a kind of international bubble for ourselves in Fujino. We were living in the Fujino community. We had many connections with the locals there, but both my wife and I were international people. And it was kind of the inbound people that were coming to the farm and volunteering and working with me to do these different projects. That was really giving us a sense of fulfillment and community in our projects. And that was taken away from us during COVID. And so we found ourselves isolated in the Tibet of Kanagawa, with our main income stream kind of threatened. And we had built this wonderful lifestyle where we were gardening and practicing permaculture design, slowly getting access to some of the agricultural land in this valley where we were building our house, but without a way to really make our income in the short term. And so my wife had the idea of an online store and the agricultural business. And so that was kind of the first evolution of Kasamatsu Farms, which up until that point was it was just our lifestyle. We had chickens, we were practicing sustainable agriculture, regenerative farming, all that. But we weren't trying to make money from it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're like, okay, maybe we should try to make money from it. And so my wife had built an online store on the Shopify platform. And we started selling organic free-range eggs and produce that we were growing to not our local community, but to the Tokyo community. So we were sending vegetables in boxes with kakubin through the parcel service, delivered next day to customers in Tokyo. And over the course of COVID, 1 year, 2 year, we were seeing a lot of success with that. It wasn't a huge moneymaker, but it was quite enjoyable at the start, and we were getting a lot of positive feedback from the customers that we were selling to. And we realized early on that our niche, unlike the guest house business, the niche for the vegetable business, we realized quickly that it wasn't the Japanese market. Why would Japanese want to buy vegetables from some random gaijin in the countryside they might just to see what kale tastes like, or beets, or some Western vegetables. But ultimately, the people who buy directly from farmers are doing it because they want a connection to where their food comes from. They want to share the story of where the food comes from. And there was a niche among expats that had that experience in the West, had come to Japan, maybe don't speak Japanese, and want to connect with a farm or a place in Japan that grows produce, go up and visit the area with their family, but they can't relate or communicate with a Japanese farmer, farm operation. So my wife quickly realized that was kind of the niche, that English-speaking expat community in Tokyo. And we leaned into that niche, really upped marketing and social media efforts, and built the website. And we were doing a pretty brisk business. We reached thousands of customers over the years, and many people became repeat
Regulars.
customers. And that was very satisfying. But the farm life started wearing on me, or at least not the farm life, but rather trying to then operate a farm as a successful business.
Basically what you were talking about before, that you didn't really want to get into.
I didn't, because it's hard to make it profitable, but it's really enjoyable if you're just doing it for yourself, sharing with your community and your neighbors, right? But once you're trying to figure out how to monetize it and make money from it, agricultural systems and mass agriculture are like they are for the same reasons that house building is the way it is, contemporary houses, because it's efficient and profitable when done at a large scale. And a small village in the mountains with steep terrain, and it's very romantic, and as far as a lifestyle, very healthy and satisfying, but it's not efficient, right? And so we realized quickly in the process of our farming venture that, in order to make it more financially successful, we really need efficiency of scale. And once you start going down that route of trying to make things efficient, it's one thing if you're on a flat land with lots of space to expand and you can have long rows and still do things organically. But when you're in a place like we were in Japan, where you have this plot and this plot, but not the plot in between, and then there's wild animals and climate change and just lots of other different local cultural factors, it was very challenging to scale.
I want to talk a little bit more about the part you enjoy, which is the actual farming itself. And we touched a couple of times on permaculture and this kind of design system. And at the beginning, it wasn't a plan. It kind of grew over the years. But today, you're somewhat operating this. I'm curious about, what does this system right now look like at Kasamatsu Farms? What are the main element of your regenerative circular farming system?
The farming systems, are you talking about the technical side of
yes, so
farming?
what do you grow, and how does each piece of your farm kind of complement the other?
Yeah, so when I first came to the village, we had an idea for a holistic plan where we would have our animal systems, we would have our food forest perennial systems, and then we would have the kind of seasonal produce that we would grow. So when we were operating Kasamatsu Farms, we were growing about 60 different types of produce, herbs, greens, and like root vegetables, summer vegetables, tomatoes in the greenhouse, and basically cycling waste systems within the farm. So for example, any green waste that was generated would then go to feeding the chicken systems. And then I had experimented with like chicken tractor systems where you keep chickens on agricultural land and move them around over time so that, the chickens eat the weeds on the fields, they eliminate like pests, and then they drop chicken poop on the plot.
That's a fertilizer.
Yeah, and so that's a very common, this chicken tractor concept is a very popularized permaculture technique that a lot of people are like, oh, whoa, that sounds really cool, I want to try that. But there's all these complications. And one of them was like the animal pressure. There'd be hawks and other predators that like would kill the chickens unless
flying
they were
in the valley and just pick up one of the
or just rip the eyes out and just like leave the carcass there, pretty gruesome stuff like that. And so I buried a lot of chickens over the years, and I realized after version 1, version 2, version 3 that like this permaculture concept of a chicken tractor is an ideal theory, but like you have to look at the situation and the environment where you are and the resources where you are. And so we kind of stopped trying to do that. We moved to a static coop system for our chicken and egg business, which is still pretty small scale. We only have about 50 chickens, and we send eggs every week to some loyal customers in Tokyo and restaurants, and we were selling produce to embassies in Tokyo as well at the time. But this whole chicken tractor model just didn't work in our particular location, because if you have to put a net over the coop to keep aerial predators from coming in, then you're not going to be moving the coop as often. And if you're not moving it, then what's the point of having a mobile coop system in the first place? You're not really getting the benefits of it. So a lot of things were learned through trial and error over the years. And then take utilizing like local waste streams, for example. In the countryside, there's just so many resources like wood or wood chips, or there's a local tofu shop that makes tofu every day, and they get like big bags of okara, which is like the byproduct from the tofu manufacturing. And so we were getting that to supplement feed for the chickens as a way to really kind of like eliminate our dependency on store-bought imported feed for the chickens. And then a thing that you often see successfully done in the West is utilizing local waste streams like restaurant compost, or compost just food scraps from restaurants or other businesses. But like I said, Fujino is not really a tourism area. So it's not like they have big hotels that have like buffet dining in the morning and then they throw out a bunch of food waste. And there's a lot of kind of cultural there might be an interest in that kind of thing, but you go down the route of like, oh, what about summertime when things start smelling? And like, it was very difficult to find local restaurants or places that would be willing to kind of cooperate with this kind of ideal approach.
So you really have you have the theory of permaculture, and then you have the practice, and then the practice really depends on where you are.
That's right.
Is there any unique advantages that you found from being in Fujino and from being here in Japan that you've practiced permaculture maybe differently than it's being discussed about in the West?
I think Japan compared to the US is it's in some ways unique because it's such a land poor country, meaning that it's just, there's not a lot of open, flat, agrable land, and it's very mountainous.
70%, right, of Japan, I think, is covered by mountains.
Mountains, right? And so there's a lot of ag land that's not being managed, right? That's kind of going back to being mountainous land that had maybe been managed in the past. Like in my village, at one point, there was 150 people living there. Now there's like 3 people living there, excluding our family. So there's these resources, but there's all these, like I said, I'd have one plot here, one plot there, one plot across town. And so a lot of time goes into thinking about how do you connect these different pieces and elements. And that's a design problem. That's like a design limitation. Whereas in the US, you might have other problems, but maybe land access in the same way is not one, because if you buy a property, it could be half an acre, 1 acre, 5 acres, 50
Very large
acres,
flat
and
land.
it's like big access to property. So the grass is always greener on the other side, right? I'm envious of people that have a farm in the US where they just have so much ag land and they don't have to worry about neighbors and, the politics of doing what I've been doing in Japan.
You mentioned earlier that one of the parts of the equation of permaculture and regenerative farming is the community.
Yeah.
How was it like for you to now move into that community in Fujino, not just so to say as a guest coming and going for your research, but now really living there, having your farm and working there?
So in some ways, it was very positive because there were a lot of people who had taken the permaculture course, moved to Fujino, were living in Fujino and had this kind of alternative or sustainable mindset and were pursuing kind of similar endeavors in their own location in the community. And so there were a lot of like-minded people, but at the same time, the original community of people who lived there, they had been doing things the way they had done for generations, and it had never been really a business for them. It had always just been an extension of their lifestyle. So in some ways, there was a lot of support from the local community, from like-minded, alternatively minded people, but there was also a lot of pushback from local people who didn't really understand outsiders' interest in their area or the more sustainable or regenerative approach to farming. It's very different from the scorched earth, Roundup sprayed on everything, contemporary way of growing vegetables in Japan. And in Japan, there's such like a social stigma associated with letting farmland go to weed. It's like meiwaku for your neighbors. It's like troublesome and problematic if you let things on your property go to weed because the weed seeds are going to blow in the wind to the neighbor's property. And it's just kind of seen as not taking it seriously, right? So I struggled over the years to kind of walk the line between my own ecological ideals about farming and sustainability and then making compromises to work with locals and work within the local system, getting a farming license through Kanagawa Prefecture and then eventually renting and purchasing farmland in the area. The expectations are very different compared to if you're coming from like a kind of regenerative or permaculture agricultural background.
So there is a lot of support, and some people are in the community very welcoming, but
those people are not originally from the community for the most part.
So they're like the new generation that also moved there and that wants to develop this, let's say, new generation rural movement. But then with the older generation, it's a bit more difficult sometimes to communicate and so on.
That's for sure, yeah. And I also found that a part of permaculture design that is often neglected. Everybody focuses on the pretty stuff. They focus on the herb spiral gardens and the chicken tractors and the, perennial food forests with the mangoes and, like fruit growing and Garden of Eden kind of thing, right? And it's all off-grid, sustainable, wonderful. But like, what happens when you have 2-3 kids down the line and you're dealing with these kind of challenges and like, where's the economic component of making this lifestyle sustainable? That's something that is kind of fundamental to like long-term sustainability for this kind of lifestyle. And it was something that I saw was kind of neglected, both within the kind of permaculture locally, the permaculture community locally in Fujino, and permaculture practitioners. They were doing their own thing, they were gardening, but like, they were still kind of struggling to get by and maybe making a lot of compromises with their lifestyle, taking a job that they don't want to take in order to just, do permaculture as a hobby. And so I realized, as we were getting deep into this lifestyle and this project along the way, and then of course, as I had growing financial responsibilities with my own growing family, we're like, well, we pursued this lifestyle because we didn't want to be worried about like, where's the money at? We didn't want just that consumer lifestyle in Tokyo, making money, spending money. We wanted what we were doing to mean something. But it meant a lot to us. But you also want to feel like the work that you're doing is being valued by society as a whole. And the way that society accrues value is by paying people for things, right? And so we began to kind of question, after we had operated the farm and at the peak of the farm production, we were working really hard. We were working like harder than most people work in a 9-to-5 job. There were no weekends, and
it's like sunrise to sunset.
Yeah, sunrise, sunset, and then throw like, a little baby onto my wife's back, and like the other 2 kids who are like helping out. But once you go from trying to just have a nice organic lifestyle to trying to run it as a business, it's like, instead of just being out in the fields happily planting potatoes with your kids, now you're like, God, we got to put the stuff into the package, and it becomes like a really like, high stress environment. And we kind of asked ourselves, well, this is not like what we wanted for this lifestyle. This is not like why we were pursuing this in the first place. And we kind of realized the limits of how we could scale that farm business. So we kind of stepped back from the agricultural production. We still have the chickens, we still grow vegetables in our own time, but we're stepping back from like operating it as like a farm business, because we were beginning to lose the joy of why we were doing this in the countryside in the first place.
So 10 years after moving out of Tokyo, out of this corporate environment into with the pursuit of this idyllic rural lifestyle, you go through acquiring properties, renovating them, developing an eco-lodge, developing a farm. And now you're back at a crossroads where you kind of reflecting upon those 10 years.
Right. And all the challenges along the way. I had big, idealistic dreams and visions for the valley. But as I said, with the fire and the people that moved out, there was a lot of trauma associated with this place for these people. And this is land that has been in their family for 600 years, since the Sengoku Jidai, like the period of warring states in Japan. And, I realized that, like, although we came with like the best intentions to the place, there was just a lot of pushback. And we built very strong relationships with the people who still lived in that village, but there'd be people coming, who saw their own houses burned down. And then they come back and visit to check the family graves, and they see these foreigners with these gaijin volunteers and, doing farming in a way that looks weird, and building a big Japanese house that's at like gaijin scale. And, they can get a bit defensive at times. And so I experienced a lot of kind of pushback with the local community in that area.
The historical community.
The historical community, not the progressive community, but the local community that made us feel like, well, maybe we just need to scale back our ambitions and just focus on, ourselves, the positive things in our life and the community that we kind of built, and figure out how then to take what we've done and built and the experiences that we've had, both with the guest house and operating the farm, and kind of connect that to the next step in our lifestyle.
What are some of the main areas where there was this pushback, where people were like, we don't want you to do this here? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, so there was the access to agricultural land. Land access in general, it's a very touchy subject, because it's almost seen as an insult to your ancestors if you sell or rent land that's been in the family for generations. It's like you're letting go of your kind of what you've built for the legacy that your ancestors left you. And some people are pragmatic. Oftentimes, if there's like an old person who's still living in the village and they have more agricultural land to manage, the pressure of not being able to stay on top of that land is greater than the ancestral pressure and the baggage. So they're like, well, it's better to rent it or sell it to somebody that can actually manage it well than it is to hold on to it and then see my neighbors see that I can't stay on top of my own stuff, right? But that wasn't the case in the village because everybody had moved out after the fire. So people still owned the land, but they didn't get any social pressure to maintain it. And so it was just kind of left to go. But then if I were to approach them and say, like, are you interested in renting the property or selling the property? People are very emotional, and because of the traumatic experience that they had, there was just a lot of, kind of pushback when it came to this kind of thing.
So what's next for Kasamatsu Farms?
I think my wife and I and our 3 kids, we really want to feel like this experience that we've had, as unique as it is, was the right decision for us at the time, in retrospect, right? Where, the house is almost complete. We ran the farm, we built the eco lodge, we renovated the kominka, we built our ideal dream eco home from scratch. And it was an incredible experience for my kids, making the earthen walls in the house, seeing me cut down the trees and being involved. We have all these wonderful memories and Instagrammable moments that, we experienced over the years doing this. But we need to figure out if we can build on that and really connect what we've done to a community or a market that values what we've done. And I don't think that's through selling vegetables. I think it's through kind of promoting the lifestyle and the experiences that we've had, building upon our knowledge base. And I think, over the years, I really, I neglected social media because I was so focused on doing it now and being in the moment and living this lifestyle and pursuing these ideals and values. I wasn't really concerned about, shooting it and documenting it and sharing the experience with other people. I was sharing the experience with other people through the volunteers and the people that were coming physically to the farm, but most people can't physically come and share the experience physically. The only way to connect with that larger audience is through social media, through the internet, through content creation. And, we've experimented with corporate outreach and training and offering the lodge as a place for companies to come up and do offsite events. And there's potential in that kind of thing, working with local companies. But I think the real interest is inbound tourism into Japan. I think there's going to be growing demand for sustainable tourism in Japan, for this kind of farm-to-table tourism, and for a level of tourism that gets away from Kyoto and Hakone and the crowded places that most people, that's all they see of Japan, So I think that that's what this area and what we've done, this experience, where the value is, and now we're just trying to figure out what's the right way to package that and offer that to people.
So there may be a lot more to see of Kasamatsu Farms, especially online in the coming years.
That's
and
right.
Hopefully many people will discover and be able to enjoy what you do there, learn from you. We didn't get to talk about everything today. We didn't go into the details of how you use the traditional charred wood
I've
technique
got lots
for building.
More stories,
we could have talked for hours, but you feel like we got a good overview of everything, or was there maybe one more thing?
I think everything that I've pursued in the last years that I've been out in the country and living this lifestyle. In many ways, it was like this dream. This Japanese dream that I had for the Japanese countryside and Akiya and Kominka and Japanese craft and everything. And I pursued that with all my heart and all my effort. And I think everybody that comes to Japan from the outside has some version of this Japanese dream that they're pursuing when they come here. But oftentimes their ideals can bump up against the reality, right? And I'm kind of interested in exploring my own experience and then also connecting with other people that have pursued their own version of the Japanese dream. So I think that's kind of the direction that it's going to go in the future in terms of working with social media and sharing our journey that we've had.
Byron, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming all the way from Fujino, for sharing your story.
Yeah.
And hopefully our listeners will have enjoyed it and be interested in connecting with you. Of course,
Yeah,
all
I'd
the
be
links
very
will
happy
be in
to.
the description. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll be back again next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Are you looking for another podcast episode to listen to next? If you like the one you just listened to, I'm sure you'll also enjoy the one that I've selected and linked in the description down below. Go check it out.